Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is what you might call a repeat because of the sins of ignorance. When I decided to get stuck into this project, I thought I'd better get a move on because, when you're my age, you can't really be sure you're going to be here next week, and so I thought, look, I better get stuck into this and better not be too flash about it either. If I'm going to write scripts for whatever I have to say, well, not only would I be here at Christmas for one, I'd be here, several Christmases trying to get the rest done. So I'm just talking off the top of my head, really. Occasionally I go to one of these books and, for something an article from a newspaper that might be useful and some, but generally I'm just talking off the top of my head. But when I began, I knew nothing. I just knew I had a phone and I knew it had a camera in it. And how you got around to making a video and somehow getting it on YouTube was all a little bit... Anyway, I thought, well, damn it, My father used to say the best way of teaching a child to swim was to throw him in the water. And, well, I'm not sure that really is such a good way of doing it, but... as far as getting this work done, I thought, well, look, I think I'd just better jump in and it's sink or swim. Well, I did tend to sink a little bit because I knew nothing about the peculiarities of lighting or anything like that. And but I've learned at least to do these things at night and with a light much closer to me. So, but the number two, wait till I do this. I was going to tell you that this is number two. This is, like Totty, she would say, show slates, and here we are. I'm showing slates, and I'm displaying that I've got number two. Now, of course, in number one, I was quite confused because when you hold that sort of thing up, when you're making this video, everything is back to front. Well, I began, and I, of course, was absolutely dumbfounded, and I thought, well, surely you don't have to write everything backwards for YouTube. But no, of course not. Everything on this screen looks back to front when I hold it up. But when you put it on the TV screen, it sort of turns itself around again and everything's okay. But nevertheless, I can tell you I'm still learning, but at least I'm not as disastrous as I was. But number two was particularly disastrous because I thought I'd do that at the daytime and, well, I was a fairly ghostly figure. But anyway, what I said I would do is try to give you some idea of the background to the world that Tully ventured into in 1864. I think if I had been asked to describe that world just off the top of my head many years ago, I would have thought he was maybe venturing into a land that was certainly peopled by the Aboriginals people, but as far as European people are concerned, I would have thought there'd be very few people there, but that's not so. By the time Tully got there in 1864, it was peopled well and truly, and there was much traffic going up and down the river. And even if you go back a couple of years, if you go back to John Nielsen's descriptions of the peopling of the Warrego in about 1863, all the land along the river was taken up and the various runs could be defined and their owners and their stock could be defined quite well. And so that was at least 12 months before Tully came. The state of Queensland was separated from New South Wales in 1859, but before 1859, Kennedy had been through in 1847, and so his descriptions of the Warrego from about south of Charleville, I think that was about his Camp 16 or something like that. I haven't got the map in front of me, but he travelled on down the river, and by the time he got down towards Delilah, I think it was getting close to Camp 19. But he wrote very glowingly of that period, of that area, as you would imagine. And you can be sure that the people who had an interest in getting land in New South Wales at that time would have been very well aware of Kennedy's journals. In 1862, Landsborough came through, and when I read stuff, people seem to say, well, it was a result of Landsborough's journals and the news of his expedition that, really got people interested. But I think that Landsborough was really, whatever influence he had, and no doubt it was a significant influence, but it was only, in a sense, building on the knowledge that had been developed years before by Kennedy. But anyway, what I wanted to do was to talk about the people who were there, probably about the time Tully came and in the years after that, what they're on about, what industry they followed, what sort of people they were. And then I was going to go on to talk about other people who came who weren't involved in sheep or cattle or horses or whatever it may have been. So that what I wanted to do was to give you a general overview of the world that Tully ventured into and that developed beyond that. So let me begin. The very first people who seemed to come there were probably the result of all that money that was sloshing around down in Victoria. The gold had been found down there, of course. And in the 1850s, there was quite a bit of money sloshing around in Victoria, and people were looking for ways of investing it. And Queensland, of course, was separated from New South Wales in 1859, and the politicians of the period, well, they had friends, and it did seem to me that some of the Queensland politicians had particular friends in in Victoria. I suspect that our friend McAllister, who'd been a member of the New South Wales Parliament, had made quite a number of friends in the South. And so the very first group of people that I'm aware of that took a bit of an interest in the area were the people who received the early grants. And the grant system was it seems to me to be, or to most people today, I think, would seem to be a fairly generous one. You don't read of the people actually being given the grants, but you read about what the people got up to after they were given the grants. The first one that I came across was an advertisement for the sale of some land in the Warrego area in late 1862. Some vendor in Melbourne was offering areas of land for sale in Queensland, and, well, my teeth nearly fell out when I discovered what this one man or this one company was trying to resell. And he had an auction all set up for 2 p.m. somewhere in Melbourne in 1862, probably October, I think it was, and he was selling this. He was selling the land that he had been granted by the Queensland government. Now, it involved most of the banks, left and right, west and east, of the Warrego River from the New South Wales border up, 230 miles on each side of the river, a total of 460 miles if you take the two sides of the river into account, going from the New South Wales border. Well, you go to 30 miles north of there. You must go pretty well towards Charleville, Gowrie, somewhere like that. I'm not quite sure. That was one parcel of land that this person was selling. The second parcel of land that he was selling was up around the Neve and the Yo-Yo. And, I don't know how many runs they were selling up that way. And then they were selling another lot of runs between Charleville, what became the Charleville area, and Morven. I don't quite know how they defined it. I think maybe they were defining it as the area between Charleville, or what became Charleville, and the Maranoa River. But anyway, they were offering to sell this, as one parcel if you could afford it. But if you couldn't, well, they were quite happy to, break it up into smaller parts, and you could not quite buy it on terms, but you could buy it in bits. Well, this was all very generous, of course. The advertisement said that the fellows, or whoever they would have been, fellow, got this land as a result of a grant by the Queensland government. So that grant had to have occurred in, 1860, 1861. I had thought that it was a grant for free, but no, it wasn't a grant for free. I checked with people in the Lands Museum, and they said, oh, no, they weren't actually given it. But there was a sort of rental payment to be made, but it had the charm of probably being not quite a peppercorn rent, but certainly a very competitive rent. But the great charm that came with it was the fact that you got the grant, you paid a sort of a rental on it, but you were free to dispose of it as you would. And so in 1862, whoever had been given the grant of all of these runs and all this land in the Warrego area, decided that they would put it up for auction, and apparently they did. And then there was another one in 1863. This was an interesting one. It probably was related to the sale of 1862. This was the sale of 30 runs, I think they may have described it, joining the Gowrie run, Flood and Gordon and so on, and extending south along the river. Well, if you take the Gowrie run and then you take the land 30 miles south along the river, you've got some pretty nicely watered country. Anyway, they had that up for sale. So that was 1863. So by the time Cully came, there were people all the way up the river because these places were snapped up. And so they were the first people that we can define as being the first sort of inhabitants of the area. And what are they up to? They're up to the same thing as people all the world are up to. I mean, very few people do anything, pure altruism, and certainly these fellows weren't involved in any altruistic activity. They, like everyone who followed them, wanted to make a buck. And as you well know, you make a buck in life in the ways that your talents best fit you to do. And their talents were taking up land and, running some animals on it, I suppose, or perhaps selling it a bit later on when they had a very large area of land that they could break up. But we do know a little bit more about them because a fellow called John Neilson contributed to the early editions of the Pew's Almanac. And I'm not sure when the first one was printed, but I certainly had a look at the one for 1864. But of course, the Pew's Almanac was printed, or published rather, about the 1st of January of each year. And so what was described in Pew's Almanac of, say, 1864 really reflected the situation in 1863. And John Neilson, who was very familiar with the whole of the river from the border, even from down in Burke, up the river, and he was pretty familiar with it up to, as far as I can tell, up to round about the Gowrie area. He seems to me to get a bit vague north of there, but nevertheless, south of there, he's really very knowledgeable. Now, where do I have a look? I've got his stuff here somewhere, and I'll tell you what here he describes. Yes, what he does is he goes up the river and he gives you a tour of the river and the land holdings and the stock that each of these people had. So I can see if I can get to the where I'm up to. So I get to Queensland. Well, round about the border, you get to Dangar's horse station, and a little bit further on, you come to a place called Cunnamulla. This was not a town. This was a property owned by Mr. Samuel Smith, Cunnamullah. you keep on going up the river and you come to Teakleman, and Mr. Danga owns a little bit more land there. Mr. Williams has got a station not far above that. And so you keep on going, Congoolan, Claverton, and then you come to John Nielson's own station, and then Dillala, of course, and so on and so on. And he can describe all of the people going up the river and what they held. Now, he also describes the stock they had. Now, I think I would have, if $1 million question, and what stock did they have, I might have said sheep, but it wasn't sheep. Most of them had cattle. At Cutterburra, the Bogan River Company had 1,200 head of cattle. Let me see. Dangar, he had 600 head of cattle. Congoolan had 2,000 head of cattle, and so on and so on. So up the river, it was mainly cattle in those very early years. When I say very early years, I mean 1862, 1863, probably 1864. But there was some sheep. Or there were rather some sheep. I saw a report in a paper I had a look at the other day, which was saying from 1865, Gowrie was very pleased with itself because its shearing for the year of their sheep had produced, on average, 3 pounds of wool from each of their sheep, and they thought this was really very, very good. But getting back to the people who sort of took up the runs and were running animals of some kind, we can't really rely upon John Nielsen much above Gowrie. After that, he becomes rather vague, and sometimes, I'm sure that he knew the area very well, but as I interpret what he wrote about the area sort of above the Charleville area, it just seems to me that he's a little vague. For instance, he seemed to describe, but surely he must mean something else. He seemed to have the Neve and the Yo-Yo and Arabella Creek, Angelala Creek rather, fairly close together, but I think that Angelala might be a little below the Yo-Yo. But the one thing he does say, of course, is that the land north of Gowrie, on the western bank and up to about the Neve and the Yo-Yo areas, he called them unsettled, I think, but I think he might have meant they were unstocked, and the problem there was a general lack of water. But once you get up around the Neve and Yo-Yo and north of there, up to the Carnarvons, we really can't rely upon John Nielsen anymore. But there was a fellow called Carl Churton. Well, his name really wasn't Carl Churton, but he wrote as Carl Churton. But of course he also wrote as Will Weasel. He wrote as a Western pioneer. He wrote as a correspondent. He wrote quite a lot, but he was very useful in doing that. But north of there, not John Nielsen, Carl Churton came out there after the flood of 1864, searching for some land, and he did seem to find some. And the impression I have is that what he found was north of Yo-Yo Creek, north of where the Neve enters the Warrego, and somewhere between there and the Carnarvons. At one stage, he always describes himself as being from Upper Warrego, but at one stage he did claim to be at Mount Playfair, but I'm not so sure about that, because he may have been joking, because he was putting himself forward as the ideal candidate for the seat of Warrego, which was a new idea. But if you have a look at Mount Playfair, it's exactly on the border between the Warrego electorate and the electorate north of there. I can't remember what it was called, maybe Leichhardt or something like that, I can't remember. But nevertheless, if you were to take the evidence of John Nielsen, the area north of the area and the Neve up to the Carnarvon area was probably as well settled as the area along the river south of what became the Charleville area in Gowrie and so on. And so if you read the reports in that particular period, they'll describe the land going up as far as Karangara, which was the name for a couple of years of Tambo. And then if you come out east towards the Maranoa, there seem to be plenty of people around. So the first people who arrived there in those very early years, and that is extending it through if we take Churton's Day to about 1864, most of the land along the river was really taken up, and taken up essentially by cattle people, although obviously there were some sheep, and maybe rather more sheep than I've found in the articles that I've seen in the paper. So they're the first lot. There was a second lot of people who turned up in 1865. Not a great number of people, but nevertheless, they were significant people. They arrived sometime in 1865. I can't remember the exact time of the year, but let me think. Probably about the middle of the year, I think. But anyway, a party of officials arrived, a gaggle of officials, together. They rode in company, much like the Canterbury Tales pilgrims. And they arrived out in Charleville, and I don't know whether it was a general rejoicing, but probably not, because at the point they arrived at the river, which was the place surveyed by, what's his name, Tully, there weren't really a great number of people there. The first people the ones who it said they were involved in building structures or establishing themselves in the 1866 petition, they had begun to straggle in, and they were there. But these officials were an interesting lot. They were also interested in making a buck. But they were an interesting crowd because, the government of the period, they didn't have much money, but they certainly didn't mind splashing money around on their friends. And so a great way of looking after your friends was to appoint them to, we'll say, you could be a police inspector or a police sub-inspector or police magistrate or whatever on a damn good salary. Now, I've got the figure of about £300 in my head for a police inspector. Now, I can't tell you where I got that figure from, but maybe it's something I read a couple of years ago. But after all, Tully, when he was Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands, his annual salary was only $500 a year. And so anyway, out these people came, and well, they weren't necessarily given to industry. There's a fellow called Thornton, Inspector Thornton. If you go to the Charleville Cemetery, he has a sort of a cement oblong tombstone in the old part of the cemetery, it's a sort of a east-west orientation, or what would that be, northeast or northeast southwest orientation, I think. In his early years, he was not noted for industry. There were some unkind things written about his reluctance to extend himself, but he stayed there for many years. In fact, he stayed there right up until just before he died. And but after he died, there was a sale in town in Charleville, which was advertised as the pick of Charleville. Well, I can tell you, Inspector Thornton certainly picked through Charleville. He couldn't have been short of funds, and did he buy up? I don't know how many blocks of land he had to sell, but boy, did he own a lot of Charleville. And, well, no doubt he could afford it on whatever the handsome emoluments were that came his way from friends in Brisbane. But anyway, that was another lot. But then, of course, there was a third lot, also interested in making a buck, but they weren't going to make big bucks, that's for sure. I don't know what staff you need or what helpers you need if you run horses, but if you run sheep, or if you ran sheep at that time, you had no fences, so you needed shepherds, and then at shearing time you need shearers. But they followed the old English pattern in so many ways, shepherds and all that sort. But you had to have the sheep washers, the people who washed the sheep. I can't imagine what a sheep washing pool looked like, but they called it the wash pool, of course. And I think they must have driven the sheep in and given them a good tub down and, a bit of kerosene soap or whatever it may have been, I don't know. But the sheep were, rather burry and dirty and all the rest of it, but they had to be cleaned up a bit before the shearing. So they came through. Then there was another lot who came through who were, gentlemen of fortune, I suppose you'd call it. They were thieves and robbers and the occasional highwayman, and they were noted for thievery particularly. When they were talking about establishing a pub at Mangalore and a township at Mangalore, Mr. Hunter, who was the storekeeper at Mangalore Station, he objected to it most vociferously because he said, look, for God's sake, if you establish a township here and if you establish a pub here, it'll become like a magnet for every malefactor in the district. Every horse thief will be there. And so, no. The idea of a pub in the town there were really, to him, quite intolerable. And he objected, as I say, most vociferously. I don't know how many bushrangers came through. It was the young fellow who came through. Bartram, Brown, he had quite a number of names. He was ended by being hanged, of course, which I think was a terrible thing because he sort of was really only playing at being a bushranger. He arrived and he met Mr. Baker, mine host of the Mangalore Travellers' Rest Hotel, and announced, "Do you know who I am? I am whatever." He didn't call himself Brown. It was some other name beginning with B. "I am the famous bushranger." And he must have arrived on a, sort of fly-bitten old steed, and he wanted something better because he demanded the best horses that were available. And but he was unsuccessful, of course, in getting them because he was captured by that time. But he did go into the pub, and he held up Mr. and Mrs. Baker. Now, they were mine hosts of the certainly not particularly successful Travellers' Rest Hotel. And anyway, he had a pistol, of course. It was not a very wonderful pistol. I don't know how wonderful pistols were in those days. You couldn't do a lot of damage with them, but anyway, he had a pistol and he demanded money from Mr. Baker. Well, they didn't have much money. I think they admitted to having about 30 shillings or something. Well, he certainly took that, but anyway, what with one thing and another, he fired a shot. The shot ricocheted and ended up implanting itself in the back of Mr. Baker. Well, in true 19th century fashion, his wife, Mrs. Baker, now where the children were, I don't know. They claimed to have about 5 kids, I think, but, they certainly weren't there on that day. Well, when Mr. Baker suffered the ricochet shot into his back, his wife screamed in best melodramatic manner, clutching whatever pearls, if she had pearls. "What have you done? You have killed my husband. You have made me a widow. You have made my children orphans." Oh dear. She must have been a great fan of 19th century melodrama. But anyway, he was captured. He was taken to court, of course. It was a big court case. But of course, after he'd injured Mr. Baker, he said to Mr. Baker, "Look, I really think you need to see a doctor." And maybe Mr. Baker was a little bit flummoxed by all of this. And so the bushranger, 19 years old I might add at the time, said, "Look, if you like, I'll write a letter to the doctor to get the doctor to come and see you," which I thought was extremely magnanimous of him. But magnanimity ended there, and so he ended up in court. The judge heard his case. At one point in the case, the young bushranger sacked his legal representative and represented himself. Not very well, I might add. But it did him no good because the law required that if you held up someone with violence, as was the case, there was only one penalty for you, and that was death. The judge more or less apologised for having to do this, but he said that's how the law stands. But he said, maybe you can hope that the sentence will be commuted, and I think that appeared from the court case to be his expectation, that given the general circumstances given the general circumstances, it was reasonable to expect that the commutation might take place. But there must have been a particularly nasty piece of work as the Premier of the time, but he refused to commute the sentence, and by the time the young man was 20, he was hanged. But anyway, you had people like that, but they were horse thieves. God, they'd thieve anything. They'd thieve hobbles, they stole saddles. Oh, you name it. It went on and on and on. That was another lot who came through. So you had a fair mixture of people. Well, okay, what about the ladies? Well, in the early days, I really don't think there were very many ladies there at all. We know that, well, in 1869 there was Mrs. Baker, and according to Brownlow, who had the first pub there, or was the first licensed publican there, in February of March 1865, he said he was accompanied by his wife, and so she was one of the early ladies there. 18, I don't read of any others until 1866, when Mary Janetsky turned up. But then, of course, there was the baby Allwood, and so there was obviously a mother in 1865, and also in 1865 another child was born down in Mangalore. So there were a few women there at that time, but not women in great numbers. And if you take the burial records from 1896 through to 1939, even if you take that overall period, men made up 65% of the burials. And so if you recorded the percentage of men and women in the burials in those very early years, I don't really think there had been would be very many women at all. There were, of course. This is in the early 1870s, I think it was. Well, I'll have a look. I've got it here somewhere. I'll just get the date. By 13 years. Well, by 1875, there were quite a number of more ladies coming through there at that time. But if you look in the newspapers of the period, the ladies who later in the century involved themselves in, dainty repasts and attending balls and dances and all the rest of it, these were fairly genteel, but they were of a bit later period. If you take the ladies who make the newspapers in 1875 and the early 1870s, the ladies weren't exactly ladies as we might know them in our literature. For instance, there was this court case in 1875 featuring two ladies in particular. One, a Mrs. Popkins, but she wasn't the lady who was the central feature of the case. The central feature of the case was a lady called Ellen Smearden. And the case arrived from the fact that Mrs. Smearden claimed to have been deflowered, well, so to speak. It was a most unfortunate day. There was an evening of big booze-up, which was apparently a very frequent thing. But Mrs. Smearden said that maybe she had had one too many nobblers. And what's more, she suspected that one of the nobblers that she was enticed to take might have been adulterated with tobacco. Now, I don't know what you can do with brandy, but nevertheless, she suspected that this young fellow had done something with the brandy. But Mrs. Smearden had quite a few nobblers by this time. She was not really able to stand up at all, and Mrs. Popkins, her friend, who was still sober enough to stand upright, managed to get Mrs. Smearden home and tried to lock her in so she could do no more damage to herself. But unfortunately, it was impossible to lock the door. Well, anyway, the guts of the matter was this, that Mrs. Smearden said that, there was a strange event during the night. She thought that her husband was being familiar with her, but imagine her surprise when she discovered that it was whatever this young fellow's name was. I can't remember his name. She had, of course, been complimenting him on his fine moustache earlier in the evening, while still reasonably sober. But anyway, it ended up in a court case, and it was a very colourful court case, I can tell you. The jury eventually retired, and after 15 minutes, they returned with a verdict of not guilty. Now, I'll hold this up. It's all back to front now. When I get it up there, it's called Gory Stories of Old Warrego. That's just a little thing that I've knocked up. There's no profit to myself, or, well, if it's going to be a profit to anyone, it might be to the historic house. But the people at Historic House tell me that people come in from time to time. They say, have you got anything about murders? Or have you got anything about ghost stories? Have you got anything, about low life? And, I thought there's plenty of low life. So I sat down one night and I gathered together all the low life stuff I could find. And I put it together in that little book. And there are not a great number of these available, but insofar as they are available, you can get them through Historic House. And I suppose if we wanted to, we could get a few more printed. But there's a story there of Ellen Smearden and Mrs. Popkins, and then there's the goings on of the police, the melee and woodening at the Morven races. The riot at the Morven races. That was in 1893, but boy, what are the goings on? This one, yes, the bush grog and the tragedy at Warrego. Terrible. And then various people had to be captured from time to time in Charleville or dragged to the lockup, and it's all here. It's not a thing you'd sit down and read all in one go, but as bedside reading, I've described it as a little bedside book of gory stories of old Warrego, and it's worth having a look at if you're interested in low life in the period. So anyway, there you go. But that is a general picture of the world that Tully arrived in to create the capital of the Warrego. So there we are. Now listen, the lighting is not too bad tonight. I'm coming on quite well,